Sweden was one of the few countries to avoid a lockdown earlier this year, relying instead on voluntary measures. Well, following a spike in new cases and ICU beds filling up, Sweden has resorted to its toughest restrictions yet. Starting on November 24th, public gatherings of more than 8 people will be banned. Bloomberg reporter Nicholas Rollander joins us now from Stockholm. Nicholas, thanks for joining us today. Sweden's approach earlier this year coincided with a much higher death rate than elsewhere in the Nordic region, but Swedish authorities stuck with the strategy. So what's changed come November?
I think the main thing that's changed between spring and now is that people are tired of social distancing, really. So as you say, it was a very, very bad situation during spring. It was much worse than most comparable countries, really. But at least a lot of people tried to do the right thing. They tried to stay home, avoid crowded spaces and so on. And this time around, I think that people appear to be a lot less willing to change their behavior voluntarily. And as you say, that's really been the basis of the entire strategy here. So now when cases are spiking again, the government felt that they really had to do something more than just issuing recommendations.
Are people following these recommendations? Do you expect them to follow the recommendations when they go into effect? Or I should say restrictions, not even recommendations.
Yeah, I mean, the cap on public gatherings will definitely be followed because it carries pretty severe penalties if you break that rule. As for the voluntary recommendations, that's more unclear. But I think what the government is hoping is that these new rules on public gatherings will send a signal and really show to people how serious the situation is right now. So I don't think anyone expects the lowering of the limit for public gatherings will have a huge effect on the development of the pandemic. But the hope is really that this will make people, incentivize people really, and make people more likely to follow the pretty strict recommendations that are already in place, but that are still voluntary.
Nicholas, what's it like on the ground in Stockholm right now? And what was it like over the summer when the world was seeing this pandemic sweep across it? There were restrictions in place everywhere except for pretty much Stockholm and Greater Sweden.
Yeah, I mean, during spring and summer, there was a very tangible difference in the streets of Stockholm. There were a lot less people going out. Restaurants were still open, but during the peak of the crisis, a lot of people stayed away. So you could tell that there was an adherence and a willingness to really follow these social distancing guidelines. I would say now in the last few weeks when we've had these new recommendations, which are pretty strict, for example, you're advised really not to meet anyone that's not part of your own household. And you're advised not to go to stores unless it's absolutely necessary. But I think from what I've seen in Stockholm and from what's been reported, people don't really adhere to that much. And there are some really crowded stores, crowded shopping malls and so on. So I think that's what the government saw as well and decided they had to step in and do something.
Well, because you didn't have lockdowns earlier this year, the economic impact wasn't as high as it was in other parts of the world. Take us through how this could affect the economy there.
Yeah, so Sweden's economy has fared relatively better than most. But I would point out that even our neighboring countries are basically performing at the same level, whereas they had more stricter lockdowns and less disease, really. But the latest estimates are that GDP is expected to contract about 3.5% this year. But this latest round of restrictions will have an impact, definitely. And so the outlook has darkened. Then to what extent, obviously, depends on the willingness of people to follow recommendations. So you could say that really the best case scenario for containing the pandemic is also the worst case scenario for the economy.
Bloomberg News' Nicholas Rollander in Stockholm, Sweden. Thanks so much for your time, Nicholas. We appreciate it.
The biggest stories the moment they happen from around the globe. Subscribe to Bloomberg Quick Take now for insight in an instant.